My sister asked me to add 3 strangers to my wedding guest list 2 months before the date, people who weren't distant cousins or childhood friends, but her fiancé Greg and his 2 teenage sons, none of whom had ever met our family. I said no, and that's when everything started unraveling, I guess. Jenna and I used to be close. She's 6 years older, and after her divorce 3 years ago, she dove headfirst into dating apps. Greg turned out to be her third match, a finance guy with a lake house and a Rolex. They got engaged 8 months later, and though I tried to be happy for her, something just felt off. He never showed up at family events, always saying he was stuck in meetings or traveling for work, and his kids, who were 14 and 16, were hardly ever around either. Whenever I asked Jenna about it, she would brush me off by saying they were just shy and that I'd eventually come to love them once we became one big family. Wedding planning had already been stressful enough. Liam and I had capped our guest list at 50 to keep costs manageable since we're both teachers and every dollar counted, even with our parents helping out. So when Jenna insisted on adding Greg and his boys, I told her it wasn't personal. It was just that we didn't have the space or budget. She immediately accused me of being selfish, arguing that I'd never accepted that she was building a new life. Even though our parents offered to cover the extra $3,000 for their meals, I refused. It wasn't about money. I really didn't want strangers in the photos or in the memories. I wanted people who truly knew us. Then, one Tuesday night around 10, she showed up at my apartment with mascara streaking down her face. She was visibly upset and announced that she was 10 weeks pregnant and that it was high risk with the doctors worried. She explained that Greg's sons already resented her for replacing their mother, who had died 4 years ago, and that leaving him out of the wedding would ruin her chance to bond with them. She kept repeating that she needed this, insisting that I couldn't possibly understand how difficult it was to be seen as the villain in someone else's story. Eventually, I backed down and agreed to let them come, but only if she promised there would be no pregnancy announcements or drama. She assured me that we should just let the family be together that day. About a week later, the RSVPs arrived. Greg had scribbled a note about how he was looking forward to blending their families, which Liam dismissed with an eye roll and a comment that blending truly required effort. In retrospect, I should have paid close attention to the warning signs, but I was too busy juggling venue contracts and seating charts. At my dress fitting, Jenna wrinkled her nose at my gown, a simple lace dress I'd kept since college, and remarked, rather unkindly, that it was just sad, suggesting that she should buy me something better since Greg apparently knew a designer. I refused her offer, but later my mom pulled me aside to confess that Jenna had been borrowing money from her. Jenna claimed it was for medical bills, yet my mom suspected it was actually for Greg's ski trips with his sons. When I brought it up with Jenna, she lost her temper and accused me of letting our mom control me. The engagement party was the first time I met Greg's kids. They spent the evening tossing soda cans into the pool and carelessly flicking cigarette butts into my rose bushes. Jenna just laughed it off, saying that, well, they were teenagers and there wasn't much to expect. Meanwhile, Greg stood by the grill, absorbed in his phone. Later that night, when I asked him to keep an eye on the boys during the wedding, he merely gave me a blank look before explaining in a detached manner that they were grieving and that I needed to cut them some slack. That same night, Liam did some digging on Greg. It turned out that he had been unemployed for 8 months, with his LinkedIn profile full of buzzwords and expired certifications, and I quickly realized that Jenna had been deceitful about him. When I confronted her about it, she broke into tears and insisted that he was trying his best, adding that not everyone could be as perfect as I was. My mom begged me not to uninvite them, worried that all the extra stress could hurt the baby. So I bit my tongue even when things escalated, like when Greg's sons accidentally knocked over the cake stand at the rehearsal dinner, or when the florist called, puzzled about why I'd suddenly upgraded the centerpieces to orchids. Jenna was always behind these mishaps, confidently assuring me that I'd be grateful when the wedding photos ended up getting all the attention. Then, 2 weeks before the wedding, Jenna sent me a message demanding a family unity photo session with Greg's kids during the reception. I told her it wasn't possible since we'd hired the photographer for a strict 5-hour block, and every minute was already scheduled. She left a voicemail that I still haven't deleted, accusing me of tearing our family apart and asking if that was really what I wanted. Now, I'm not really sure what I want anymore. I just find myself standing in a half-decorated venue, staring at a clipboard, and wondering how my sister became someone I no longer recognize, and how I ended up being the villain simply for wanting one day, just one day, to be about me. Liam thinks we should have eloped, and maybe he's right, but I've worked too hard to let this go, even if it means swallowing my pride or letting Jenna have her way. With only 13 days to go until the wedding, I honestly have no idea who's actually going to show up. Now for the first update. It's been a week since I caved and let my sister Jenna bring her fiancé Greg and his sons to my wedding. I thought setting boundaries would help, but now I'm starting to wonder if I've just handed her a shovel to dig us all deeper. The call came last Tuesday. Jenna was hysterical and gasping as she explained that Greg's ex-in-laws were threatening to sue for custody of his kids if he abandoned them for my wedding. Her voice gave the impression she had been rehearsing the panic, insisting that everyone needed to see his dedication as a father, and suggesting that the boys be allowed to speak at the reception to prove we were a united family. I almost laughed, since speeches were normally meant for the bridal party, people who had known Liam and me for much longer than 6 months. But when I refused, she ended the call abruptly. The next day, Greg showed up at my school during lunch break. I teach 3rd grade, and I was startled to see him leaning casually against the bulletin board outside my classroom, arms crossed and dressed in a suit that was a little too sharp. He mentioned, as if reciting a corporate mission statement, that the boys needed to feel included instead of being rejected. I informed him that the guest list was final. Although he left without further argument, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling I got from the way he looked at my students, as if they were proof of some personal shortcoming. Later that night, Liam discovered that $2,000 was missing from our joint savings. My stomach dropped, knowing I had lent that money to Mom months ago when Jenna had an emergency ultrasound, with the assurance it would be repaid before the wedding. When I called her, she explained that Jenna had been struggling with stress and her pregnancy, and that she had been covering Jenna's rent. I pressed my forehead against the kitchen counter, wondering when my family had turned into a sinking ship with only me trying to plug all the holes. The venue walkthrough was meant to be a calm final check, but things took a turn when Jenna brought Greg's sons along. They snickered at the mason jar centerpieces and made exaggerated gestures at the seating chart, with the older one muttering something about sunflowers as he kicked a chair leg. Greg was busy recording them on his phone as if they were starring in a vlog, and he seemed pleased when the younger one pretended to stumble near the faux altar. I asked him to rein the boys in, but he simply dismissed my concern by saying they were just kids and that I should lighten up. Shortly after, the florist called to inform me that Jenna had swapped my chosen baby's breath and dahlias for orchids, claiming I had forgotten to finalize the order. I couldn't believe it. Orchids were the same flowers she had been so excited about at her own failed engagement party. When I confronted her about it, she snapped that I would eventually be thankful when the photos went viral before abruptly ending the call. I stared at my Pinterest board, which featured calming soft blues and yellows that now clashed with those bold, waxy blooms, and I felt as if I had lost the last bit of control. Mom later described the whole mess as a misunderstanding, a word she seems to favor these days. She admitted that she had been covering Jenna's rent out of fear that the stress might cause a miscarriage, claiming that Jenna was fragile at the moment. That explanation did little to excuse the lies, the constant demands, or the way Jenna would always grip my shoulders a bit too tightly while insisting that family always comes first. That night, Liam brought me 2 glasses of wine and suggested we elope, cancel the venue, get married at the courthouse, and save the money for a house. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine a simpler wedding with no elaborate centerpieces, no lengthy speeches, and no unwelcome interference from Greg. But I quickly thought about the deposits we'd forfeit, my dress hanging untouched in the closet, and the bridesmaids who had already rearranged their schedules. I admitted that I'd invested too much into this whole affair, and although Liam nodded in agreement, his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. The following morning, I received Jenna's baby shower invitation, which turned out to be scheduled on the same day and at the same time as my bridal shower, 2 p.m. at a boutique hotel downtown. When I reached out to her over text, she apologized profusely, explaining that the venue had only that time slot available. I drove over to her place, bracing myself for a confrontation, only to find her casually curled up on the couch watching reality TV, her nails freshly manicured, and the apartment filled with the scent of lavender and what felt like denial. She dismissed the situation by claiming it was just a shower and that I would have other parties later. Mom urged me to make an effort, so I went to Jenna's shower first. The decorations were everywhere: balloons, a 3-tier cake, and gift bags complete with custom onesies, declaring someone as Auntie's favorite. Greg's sons lingered near the snack table, tossing grapes at each other, and Jenna even snapped a selfie with me in an effort to remind everyone that we were still a team. I later arrived at my bridal shower about 40 minutes late, only to find that my maid of honor had already cut the cake. The guests avoided eye contact, and their conversation quieted noticeably when I entered. Later on, Liam's parents even offered to hire security after Greg's sons made reckless jokes about setting off fireworks during the ceremony. I tried to laugh off the remark, but it wasn't long before I discovered an ultrasound photo in my mailbox, accompanied by Jenna's messy handwriting that expressed excitement for my wedding day and noted a due date of November 12th, just 2 days after the wedding. I tucked the note into my planner, where the date loomed every time I reviewed my schedule. Then things took a darker turn when vandalism occurred. I found that Greg's sons had scribbled "Gold Digger" on Jenna's car using lipstick. Instead of confronting the boys directly, Jenna turned her anger on me, insisting that their behavior was a reaction to the exclusion I had imposed. The boys seemed to smirk as they passed the lipstick tube back and forth, which made me want to challenge Jenna and ask why she was fighting so hard for a man whose kids clearly resented her. But she kept scrubbing the windshield while her pregnancy app continued to send alerts in the background. The rehearsal dinner turned out to be the final straw. Greg's sons managed to accidentally knock over the cake, sending fondant splattering all over the floor. Greg seemed to chuckle at the mishap, while Jenna brushed it off by dabbing at the frosting with napkins and insisting that it wasn't a big deal. Through all the chaos, Liam held my hand firmly under the table, his thumb gently drawing circles that somehow managed to keep me steady. As we left that night, Jenna grabbed my arm and said we needed to talk the next day about something concerning Liam, using a tone of feigned concern that was all too familiar from our high school days when she would borrow my clothes and return them stained. I ended up losing sleep over the whole ordeal. Now, with only 7 days left before the wedding, I find myself staring at the security contract that Liam's parents drafted, which even includes a clause for the removal of any uninvited guests. Part of me, in a hopelessly cynical way, hopes we'll end up needing it, while another part still clings to the memories of a 9-year-old me sharing a bunk bed with Jenna and whispering secrets after lights out. I honestly can't tell which feeling is stronger anymore. All I know is that my wedding dress still hangs in its garment bag, the orchids are on their way, and my sister's promises seem as fleeting as sugar dissolving in the rain. Whatever happens next, all I want is to marry Liam, and everything else just feels like collateral. Now for the second update. It's been 3 days since my last update, and here I am staring at my wedding photos, not the ones from the album, but the mental snapshots of chaos I just can't unsee. I guess some part of me knew it would unravel, but I never imagined how loud the end would be. It all started when Jenna showed up unannounced at my apartment with red eyes and thrust a phone in my face. She tried to get me to look at a blurry photo on the screen showing Liam laughing with a woman at a bar, his arm lightly touched by hers. My stomach sank, though not for the reason Jenna had hoped. It turned out that Liam's cousin had visited last month, a person I'd only met twice. When I brought it up, Jenna simply shrugged and explained that she was trying to help, mentioning that Mom thought I was being naive, but that she actually cared. The tone in which she said it felt as if she were handing me a gift, and it made me snap back that she wasn't helping at all, but rather sabotaging everything. She then broke down in tears, and for a moment I nearly apologized until I remembered the $2,000 missing from our savings, the orchids, and the lipstick marks on her car. About an hour later, Mom called in a fury and scolded me for what she considered an attack on someone too fragile. I recalled how often that word had been thrown around lately, almost as if it was a brand. I asked, with a steadiness I did not feel, why she always took Jenna's side, but there was only silence before the call ended. The next day, the venue coordinator quit after Greg's sons had prank called her, pretending to be me and demanding a refund because the place reeked of desperation. I spent an hour pleading for her to stay, while I repeatedly explained that I didn't despise her floral choices and that I would, if necessary, pay extra for the hassle. In the end, she relented, though I could still hear the uncertainty in the way she agreed. Later that night, Liam's mom sent a text with a TikTok video attached. In it were Greg's sons vaping in the aisle during the ceremony, and the older one was mockingly reciting our vows in a high-pitched tone. Jenna later claimed that they had been framed, as if someone had digitally altered the video to insert their smirking faces. I didn't argue. Instead, I sold my grandmother's necklace, the one left to me in her will, with a note urging me to use it as armor, and hired security. 2 days before the wedding, I discovered Jenna's pregnancy announcement cards in her purse. They declared in bold what looked like "sweetest surprise coming soon," with the date of my wedding stamped in gold. Naturally, she denied any wrongdoing, insisting that she would never steal my spotlight, even as she clutched her barely noticeable bump. Yet I couldn't help but notice how her nails dug into her palms in the same way they did when, as kids, she used to hide my homework. My bridesmaid Mara overheard Greg's son boasting about a big surprise during the reception, I didn't sleep a wink that night as I replayed every family dinner where Jenna had, supposedly by accident, spilled wine on my dress or forgotten my birthday. Liam held me close, his silent presence proving far more comforting than any words could. On the morning of the wedding, Jenna called in a shrill, accusing tone, blaming me for Greg's absence. I could picture her pacing around their apartment, the one Mom had been paying for, with unpacked baby gifts scattered about. She reassured herself, promising that Greg would come, and when she finally arrived late, her makeup was smudged and her dress wrinkled. It turned out the boys weren't with her. She explained in a low murmur that they were with Greg, all the while avoiding eye contact. During our vows, Greg's son yelled from the back row that the whole scene was boring, prompting security to escort him out. Jenna, unable to contain herself, cried that they were just kids, though her pale and panicked expression told a different story. The reception only deteriorated further when Jenna grabbed the microphone with an overly bright tone to announce that, with everyone present, they were expecting a boy. The room fell silent, and mid-announcement, Greg walked in, took one look at her, and left. Jenna then chased after him, sobbing, while guests muttered about the unfolding drama and how tacky everything had become. Later on, Liam found a note on the gift table accompanied by her ultrasound photo, the due date scribbled in her loopy handwriting, reading as if it were today's date. I didn't cry. I simply folded the note into a small square and tucked it into my clutch beside the emergency Xanax I'd promised myself I would never need. The photos from the wedding came out perfectly. In every shot, I'm smiling, not that stiff, practiced grin from the engagement party, but something looser and real. There's no sign of Jenna's chaos, just Liam's hand on my waist and the orchids wilting quietly in the background. Yesterday, Mom left a voicemail. There wasn't any apology in it, just a curt message that she hoped I was happy. And in a strange way, I actually was. Not because of any happiness on her part, but because for once I hadn't sacrificed myself to keep Jenna comfortable. Now, the guest room in our new house was slowly turning into a nursery, as we were expecting next spring. Sometimes I still catch a whispered echo of her voice in my head, suggesting that I had always resented her, and I can't help but wonder if she might be right. But resentment feels too heavy a word. It's more like grief for the sister who used to sneak Pop-Tarts into our fort, not for the stranger who had weaponized love. I hope she finds her way eventually, but I refuse to be the one lighting that path. Now for the final update. It's been 2 weeks since the wedding, and I'm sitting here with a stack of unopened mail. Half of it still addressed to Mrs. Jenna's sister in someone's messy cursive, and the rest filled with bills for security cameras. Go figure. Jenna showed up at my door 3 days after the reception, with no makeup and her hair all tangled, clutching a Starbucks cup like it was a lifeline. She didn't even wait for an invitation before launching into a long explanation about how Greg had left her because of the pressure I supposedly put on their relationship. I couldn't help but notice how her voice carried that same high-pitched tremor from our childhood, the very one she had when we'd get in trouble for our mischief. This time, though, there was no one to step in to mediate, just me, my cold coffee, and the faint aroma of smoke coming from the neighbor's grill. That same night, Mom called without any greeting, simply stating that I needed to know something. I later discovered that she had known for months that Greg's ex-in-laws were suing for custody of the boys. Jenna had lied about being pregnant in order to keep him from leaving, but the real twist was that there was no baby at all. She had miscarried weeks before the wedding, yet continued the charade with a fake bump to guilt Greg into staying. I couldn't believe that someone could even order those kinds of props online. The truth became even clearer when the boys turned up at my house unannounced, looking more like frightened kids than the little terrors who had trashed my backyard. The older one, Ethan, mumbled that Jenna had given them $200 each to put on a little act at the wedding, meant to demonstrate how hard it was to blend families. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for them. Even though their mom had been gone for less than 2 years, they were now caught up in Jenna's desperate game. Eventually, Mom cut Jenna off financially after discovering that the money meant for an ultrasound had been spent on a designer handbag. Jenna's apartment lease ran out last week, and now she's been couch surfing with coworkers who probably have no idea she's also behind the disappearing staplers. Meanwhile, Greg is fighting for full custody, and honestly, I really hope he wins, because the boys deserve better than being used as props in yet another one of her dramas. Liam and I decided to use what was left of our wedding savings to put a down payment on a house about 45 minutes away. It has a porch, a creaky floorboard in the kitchen, and absolutely no room for uninvited guests. When Jenna called last week with a shaky voice asking if she could stay in the spare room for a bit, I didn't hesitate to refuse. My answer was simple and final, leaving no room for negotiation, and she hung up almost immediately. The wedding photos arrived yesterday, and there's one of Liam dipping me during our first dance while both of us laughed like idiots. Not a single picture of Jenna's meltdown ended up in the final selection. The florist even waived the cost for the orchids, since they had been barely holding on by the time the reception started. Later that evening, Mom left a voicemail that wasn't exactly an apology but came close. She expressed regret that things had turned out the way they did, almost as if she were reciting a line from a Hallmark card. Now we're somewhat civil. She sends meatloaf recipes, and I send back photos of the dog. It isn't perfect, but it's something. To add another twist, Greg's ex-mother-in-law sent me a thank you note explaining that the boys, who are now in therapy, were finally starting to behave more like teenagers. I ended up sticking that note on the fridge next to a grocery list. Then I received a letter from Jenna's old coworker, an actual letter, stamped and all. It turned out that Jenna had lied about being a senior manager to impress Greg, going so far as to fake business trips and everything. Part of me wants to frame that letter as a reminder of just how far she was willing to go to keep up appearances, while another part of me simply feels exhausted by it all. This past weekend, we adopted a rescue dog, a scrappy terrier mix with one ear that flops sideways. Liam wanted to name her something tough like Rogue or Berserker, but I ended up choosing Orchid. The look on his face when I announced it was absolutely priceless. Now the guest room has been painted a soft yellow that reminds me of sunlight, and we're turning it into a nursery since I'm due in April. When I told Liam the news, he cried into my shoulder for a full 10 minutes, although I kept quiet about the fact that the due date coincidentally matched Jenna's fake one. Some secrets, it seems, are better left unsaid. Last night, I discovered a voicemail from her in which she apologized and admitted that I was right about everything, her voice cracking in the process. I deleted the message before I could second-guess myself. Forgiveness isn't something that happens on a whim. It's a slow burn, and I'm just not there yet. Sometimes when I'm folding baby clothes or untangling Orchid's leash, I catch myself humming a silly song that Jenna and I used to make up as kids, with ridiculous lyrics about marshmallows and rocket ships. I miss that simpler version of her, the one who would share her pudding cup with me if I promised not to mention the broken vase to Mom. But the person she grew up to be, who weaponized every secret and vulnerability, is someone I simply cannot miss. We're done. Not out of anger, but for the sake of survival. I truly hope she finds her way someday, even if it means my porch light will stay off for good.